Hey everyone, welcome back. I know a lot of you are really interested in figuring out what's going on with homeowners insurance, especially with all the news about those crazy wildfires out in LA.
Yeah, it's definitely been a wake-up call for a lot of folks.
Totally. And it makes you wonder, how safe is our insurance really? What's the deal with all these rising costs we keep hearing about?
Well, you're in the right place to get some answers, that's for sure.
Right, so we're diving deep into this really important report that just came out from the U.S. Department of the Treasury.
Specifically from the Federal Insurance Office. It's called U.S. Department of the Treasury Report. Homeowners insurance costs rising, availability declining as climate-related events take their toll.
Catchy title, huh?
Well, it gets the point across.
It does, it does. And this report, it dropped just a few days ago, January 16th, 2025.
Yep, brand new.
Fresh off the presses. And what's really impressive about this report is the sheer amount of data they analyzed. I mean, we're talking over 330 different insurance companies.
And 246 million homeowner policies. It covers the years 2018 to 2022.
So a massive undertaking.
For sure. It's unprecedented, really. And it gives us such a clear picture of, how climate change is impacting what we pay for insurance.
And if we can even get insurance at all in some places.
Right. And what all of this means for us, for everyone across the U.S., because this isn't just about individual homeowners. It has ripple effects on the whole economy.
Okay, so let's break this down a little bit. One of the first things that really stood out to me in the report was how much prices are going up. I mean, they said average premiums increased 8.7% faster than inflation between 2018 and 2022.
Yeah, that's a significant jump.
For sure. But here's the thing that I found even more interesting. It wasn't happening everywhere at the same rate.
That's where the report gets really interesting because it actually pinpoints climate change as the reason for these uneven increases.
Oh, wow. So how did they explain that?
Well, imagine if you took a map of the U.S. and you color-coded all the different ZIP codes based on how much risk they face from things like wildfires.
Floods, hurricanes.
Exactly, all those climate-related perils. What they found was that the 20% of ZIP codes with the highest risk, so the darkest colors on our map, those areas ended up paying a whopping 82% more for their insurance premiums compared to the areas with the lowest risk.
Like 82% more. That's a huge difference.
It's massive, and it really highlights how much climate change is changing the game when it comes to homeowners insurance.
So not only is climate change causing more extreme weather, but it's directly impacting people's wallets when it comes to protecting their homes.
And it's not just homeowners who are feeling the pressure either. Insurance companies themselves are being squeezed by this whole climate change situation.
Right. So I guess you could say that more frequent storms, more wildfires, more floods, they all lead to more insurance claims.
And those claims are becoming more expensive to cover.
Right. So insurers are seeing their costs really pile up, especially in those areas that are most at risk.
Exactly. And that's why the report highlights this thing called the paid loss ratio.
The paid loss ratio.
Yeah. It's a way to look at how much insurers are paying out in claims compared to how much they're taking in from premiums. And it's kind of like, imagine a bakery that sells cakes for $10 each.
Okay, I'm following you.
But if the ingredients and the labor for each cake cost them $12 to make?
They're losing money.
Exactly. And it's a similar situation with insurance in these high-risk ZIP codes. They're having to pay out more in claims than they're taking in through those premiums.
So that's not sustainable in the long run.
Not at all. And that brings us to another really important finding in the report, which is this idea of policy non-renewals.
Okay, what exactly does that mean?
It basically means that insurance companies are becoming much more hesitant to offer coverage in climate-vulnerable locations.
So they're dropping people.
In a way, yeah. They might choose not to renew a policy when it comes up for renewal, or they might just decide not to offer any new policies in certain areas.
Okay, now that is really concerning. So it sounds like people living in these areas are facing this double whammy. They're dealing with skyrocketing prices, and they're also at risk of losing their coverage altogether.
It's a scary situation for a lot of homeowners.
So does the report say how much more likely people are to get dropped by their insurer if they live in one of these high-risk areas?
Yeah, they found that non-renewal rates in the highest risk ZIP codes were 80% higher than in the lowest risk ZIP codes.
80%. That's a huge gap.
It is. And it makes you wonder, if you're living in one of those areas, is it just a matter of time before you can't get insurance at all?
Right. And even if you can find coverage, what's it going to cost?
Exactly. It's a really tough situation for a lot of people.
And it's not just about individual homeowners either, right? I mean, this whole issue has these ripple effects that can impact the entire economy.
That's right. Think about it. If homes in certain areas become too risky or too expensive to insure, what happens to property values?
They go down.
Exactly. Property values drop, and that affects property taxes, which then hurts local governments.
So suddenly you have this whole chain reaction that can destabilize entire communities.
You got it.
Wow. It's pretty overwhelming when you think about it.
It is. But I think it's important to acknowledge that this report, the fact that it exists at all, is a good sign that people are starting to pay attention to this issue.
So maybe we can see this as, a step in the right direction.
I think so, because this report wasn't just some random study. It was actually commissioned in response to President Biden's 2021 executive order on climate-related financial risks.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So it's clear that the government is taking this issue seriously.
And that they're proactively trying to figure out, how to deal with this whole thing.
Absolutely. And they're not just going it alone either. The Federal Insurance Office worked really closely with the National Association of Insurance Commissioners and state insurance regulators to gather all of this data. So it was a really big collaborative effort.
Okay, so it sounds like they're really trying to get a handle on the big picture here. But what about the data itself? Is this something that people can actually see? Or is it just sitting in some government file cabinet?
Well, here's the best part. The Treasury is releasing a good portion of the data to the public.
Oh, wow, really?
Yeah, they're all about transparency on this one, which I think is great. It means that researchers, policymakers, even just everyday people like us can dig in and see what's happening in their own communities.
That is fantastic. The more we know, the better equipped we are to deal with all of this. Okay, but before we go any further, I want to bring it back to those wildfires in Los Angeles.
Yeah, it's hard not to see those fires as a really stark example of what this report is warning us about.
Exactly. And it's not just California either, right? I mean, this is happening all over the country.
For sure. Climate change is impacting every state in different ways.
So, given everything we've learned about rising insurance costs, the risk of losing coverage, and, the fact that climate-related disasters are becoming more frequent and more severe, how do you see all of this playing out in areas like LA that are really on the front lines of this whole climate change thing?
That's the million-dollar question.
And that's what we're here to explore.
Hmm.
So stay with us, folks, because we're just getting warmed up.
I mean, these wildfires that we're seeing in California, it really highlights the challenges that homeowners are facing, not just there, but in other parts of the country, too.
Yeah, it's scary to think about. Definitely. Like, you buy a house, you put down roots, you think you've built this, safe and secure future for yourself.
Right.
But then suddenly you're facing all these risks, huge risks that are basically out of your control.
And it's not just the wildfires either.
It's everything.
Yeah, we're talking hurricanes, floods, severe storms, droughts. I mean, the list goes on.
All of these things that can cause serious damage to your property.
And trigger those, massive insurance claims that we were talking about.
And as we saw in that report, the costs of all these events, they're not hitting everyone equally.
That's a really crucial point, I think. This report really shines a light on how climate change is kind of amplifying existing inequalities.
Right, because it's not like climate change picks and chooses who to hit.
Exactly. But the fallout, it definitely lands harder on some people than others.
So, who's getting hit the hardest?
Well, sadly, it's often lower income communities and communities of color that are most impacted by these climate disasters.
And I'm guessing they're also the ones who have the hardest time getting affordable insurance in the first place.
Often, yes. So it becomes this social justice issue on top of everything else.
Okay, so we've talked about the problems, the risks, the inequalities.
Yeah, it's a lot.
It is. But what about solutions? What can we actually do to try and, I don't know, tackle these challenges and maybe make the homeowners insurance system more resilient, maybe even fairer?
That's the big question. And honestly, there's no easy answer.
Yeah, it's complex.
It is. I think it's going to take a multi-pronged approach to make any real difference.
Okay, so what are some of the things that we could be doing?
Well, first and foremost, I think we have to keep investing in ways to both slow down climate change and also adapt to the changes that are already happening.
So it's kind of like we're trying to fix the engine while also steering the ship through a storm.
Exactly. We need to do both at the same time. And this isn't something that any one person or entity can do on their own. It requires collaboration across all levels of government.
The private sector, too.
Absolutely. And everyday citizens as well. We all have a part to play in building a future where we can, weather these storms, so to speak.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
But zooming in a little bit, what about the insurance industry specifically? What can they do to help, solve this puzzle?
Well, I think insurers have a huge role to play in making things both more resilient and affordable. They could develop new kinds of insurance products that are specifically designed for homeowners in those high-risk areas.
Okay, so like tailored solutions.
Right. Or they could work directly with communities to put risk reduction measures in place, things that can actually help lower the chances of damage happening in the first place, which could then lower insurance costs.
So instead of just reacting to problems, they could be more proactive and like actually help find solutions.
Exactly. They can be partners in building resilience.
Working with homeowners and communities.
Right, to create a more sustainable and secure future for everyone.
It's amazing how this conversation has gone from like insurance policies to the fate of entire communities.
It's all connected.
It really is. And while we're focused on the U.S. here, I mean, this is obviously a global issue.
Absolutely. Climate change is impacting homeowners all over the world.
So we need solutions that work on a global scale too.
Right. We need to be sharing what works, collaborating on research, supporting countries that are being hit the hardest.
Yeah, it's a big challenge, but we can't afford to ignore it.
Definitely not.
So as we start to wrap things up, I guess, like, what are some key takeaways for our listener? What do you want them to walk away with?
Well, I think the most important thing to remember is that climate change is already having a real impact on homeowners insurance.
This isn't something that's way off in the future.
No, it's happening now.
And it's something that every homeowner needs to be aware of, no matter where they live.
But as we discussed, the risks aren't evenly distributed.
Right. Some communities are facing much bigger challenges than others.
So it's really important for people to understand their own personal level of risk, and that depends on where you live, the type of home you have, all sorts of factors.
So knowledge is power, I guess.
Exactly. Once you understand your risk, then you can start taking steps to protect yourself.
And what are some of those steps?
Well, it could be anything from reinforcing your home against specific climate hazards to, really understanding your insurance coverage and maybe exploring different options.
Or even advocating for policy changes.
Right. At the local, state, or national level, anything that can promote resilience and affordability.
So it's about taking action in your own life, but also pushing for bigger systemic change.
It's both.
We can all be part of the solution.
Absolutely.
One of the things that I found really encouraging about this whole report was the level of collaboration that was involved.
Yeah, that was great to see.
The fact that the government is taking this issue seriously, working with the insurance industry, working with state regulators, gathering information, trying to find solutions.
It shows that people are starting to wake up to this challenge.
But ultimately, it comes down to all of us, right? As individuals, as communities, as a global society, we need to make choices that prioritize a more sustainable and equitable future.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Okay, well, we've covered a lot of ground today.
We have.
But before we wrap up completely, I want to leave our listener with a question to ponder. So, given everything we've talked about today, what are some actual steps that people can take right now to figure out, what their own risks are and how can they protect themselves, their homes, their finances, all of that, with all these changes happening in homeowners insurance?
It's about getting informed and getting engaged, taking ownership of this issue.
Because it's not enough to just be aware of what's happening.
Right. Awareness is important, but it's got to lead to action.
So what kind of action are we talking about?
Well, there's a bunch of things you can do. Think about making changes to your property, like actually making it more resilient to those specific climate hazards you're facing.
So like fortifying your home, basically.
Yeah. Or talk to your insurance agent, really understand what your coverage is, what it does and doesn't cover.
That's a good point. Yeah.
And maybe even get involved in advocating for policy changes at the local level, state level, even the national level.
Wow. So it can be pretty big picture stuff.
It can be. But it can also be small, everyday choices, too.
And don't underestimate the power of community either, right?
Absolutely. Talk to your neighbors, share what you're learning, work together to build a stronger, more prepared neighborhood.
There's strength in numbers, for sure.
Yeah, for sure. This has been a really interesting deep dive. I really appreciate you having me on to talk about all this.
The pleasure was all mine. I feel like I learned a ton.
It's great to see this issue getting the attention it deserves.
And to you, dear listener, thanks for joining us on this journey. Remember, knowledge is power.
The more we understand these challenges, the better we can create solutions for a safer, more sustainable future.
So keep those questions coming, keep learning, and keep diving deep into the things that matter.
Until next time, happy exploring.
See you later.